Yale Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Quadcast, a Yale Divinity School podcast series focusing on issues related to religion, culture, and politics. In this episode, YDS alum Emily Judd interviews Tisa Wenger, professor of American Religious History at Yale Divinity School. Professor Wenger discusses her research on how the U.S. government used religion as a tool to justify taking indigenous lands.
There's a whole host of ways, I would say, that American policymakers drew on really specifically Christian ideas to legitimize the theft of indigenous lands and the dispossession of indigenous nations.
She challenges the idea that the United States was founded on the ideal of religious freedom for all.
Freedom was pretty limited, right? To whom did it actually apply? And religious freedom is always kind of limited in part based on what you consider to be legitimate religion.
And Professor Wenger discusses the importance of the new Yale University certificate in Native American and Indigenous Studies.
Having a structure there, having the recognition there, having the legitimacy that we matter.
You have a new book, Spirits of Empire: How Settler Colonialism Made American Religion. And in the book, you argue that the U.S. government in the 18th and 19th centuries used religion as a tool to secure power and justify conquests of indigenous lands. How did early Americans draw on these religious ideas to legitimize the taking of indigenous lands?
There's a whole host of ways, I would say, that American policymakers drew on really specifically Christian ideas to legitimize the theft of indigenous lands and the dispossession of indigenous nations. First of all, of course, is the doctrine of discovery, which is the idea that Christian and civilized nations, or nations that consider themselves to be Christian and civilized, claimed the right to govern and seize the lands of places that they claim to have discovered, right? And this is based originally on papal decrees from the 15th and 16th centuries, and then was developed in various ways and kind of claimed as a convenient principle and really legal fiction by all of the European empires. And so when the United States claimed its independence from the British Empire, as a matter of course, just continued to assume the right that this kind of legal claim under the doctrine of discovery. Native people were depicted as being merely kind of wandering savages who did not actually own their land. They had sort of a temporary right of possession under this legal doctrine. Thomas Jefferson and many other early U.S. leaders explicitly wrote and talked about Native people and Native land in this way.
And in the book, you emphasize that indigenous peoples were not passive in the face of colonial power, but they actually used religion in strategic ways, including reshaping Christianity itself. What did that look like in practice?
Yes, really important question. And it was important to me that this book not perpetuate a kind of erasure of Native people or a narrative in which Native people are only victims of violence. Ojibwe scholar Gerald Weisner coined the word survivance to talk about how Native cultures, Native peoples don't just sort of survive in a bare physical way of surviving, but find ways actively to survive and do more than survive. And what they do this, right, by creatively accommodating themselves to the new circumstances of colonization and maintaining their own traditions, but in new forms. And so Christianity for them, for some of them, becomes one way to do that. Some Native people described, kind of detailed in my book, adopt Catholicism, invite in Catholic priests and Catholic churches and embrace Catholicism. Some of the Potawatomi and Odawa people in the Great Lakes region become very committed Catholics. They had long histories of Catholic missions during the earlier French colonial period, but there'd been kind of a gap, right? And most people from these tribal nations had not been Catholic continuously all through that, but they had a kind of memory of Catholic missions. And for them, Catholicism was a little more distant from the centers of U.S. power. So this is one way to understand why they might have chosen Catholicism and kind of explicitly, directly really rejected Protestant missions. I think the Catholic priests to them felt both a little more familiar from that longer history and also like not so directly allied with the U.S. government. And some of the Protestant missions at that time, including some of those that I profile in the book, were really directly advocating for and working with the U.S. government in the project of a kind of genocidal Indian removal, right? Trying to push Native people off their lands and push them west of the Mississippi in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, where the Catholic Church ultimately went along with that, also had a kind of civilizing mission, but was not as closely allied. There's a lot of anti-Catholicism in the United States at this time. So anyway, Christianity, other Native people chose to become Protestant. And one of the reasons I think for that is, first of all, it made a difference sort of what missions presented themselves to Native communities. It made a difference. Sometimes individual leaders become compelled by a particular message or build a relationship with a particular missionary. Protestant churches sometimes provided more autonomy, so Native communities could ordain their own minister, have their own church in a way that isn't possible under the Catholic hierarchy. But others say, no, we don't want anything to do with this white man's religion. Our religion is our tribal religion. And so they kind of claim the category of religion in that way. To push back, it becomes a means of claiming cultural sovereignty, redefining their own traditions in a way that might allow them to claim space for their own cultural traditions under that circumstance. Some of the Native people in the Great Lakes region managed to hold on to lands and are still there in their homelands today, even though many lost more and more land over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, and some have rebuilt land bases more recently with federal recognition for their tribal status. They're still there, right? Others, particularly in the southern Great Lakes region, were pushed west into what was then called Indian Territory, Kansas and Oklahoma, and have reservations in that area now.
I want to go back to something that you had said about the U.S. government at that time, maybe using some missionaries, Protestant missionaries, or whichever Christian denomination to go and help them in their taking of the land. Many Americans think of the United States as founded on religious freedom. How does your research challenge that narrative? If you can explain a little bit more about, as you mentioned, how the government was working at that time.
Yeah, well, and I'll try to keep this brief. And the United States was founded with religious freedom as one of its foundational ideals, right? There's no doubt about that. I think that my research, among others, what it shows is that freedom was pretty limited, right? To whom did it actually apply? And religious freedom is always kind of limited in part based on what you consider to be legitimate religion. White Americans and colonizers oftentimes did not recognize Indigenous practices or credit them or legitimize them as being legitimately religious. And so said, they don't have any religion. Over the course of the 19th and well into the 20th century, when the concept of religious freedom was applied by the federal government to Native Americans, it was pretty much applied only to the extent that, they have the right to choose whether to be Protestant or Catholic, whether to be Baptist or Presbyterian, right? It didn't, throughout the 19th century, Native practices of all kinds, whether you call them religious or not, right, were outlawed and forbidden. And particularly starting in the 1870s, which is the time period in kind of in Native American history, federal Indian policy that we talk about as a kind of assimilationist period. By that time, virtually all Native nation tribes had been kind of confined to reservations, which are effectively sites of incarceration at this time, right? Governed, by federal Indian agents who had a huge amount of discretionary power, and the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. This is history that goes beyond the scope of this particular book, but I've worked on it in some of my earlier research and kind of know the history pretty well. But there was a Indian Crimes Code promulgated in the 1880s that outlawed medicine men, any kind of dance ceremonies, anything that was categorized by the U.S. government as savage or heathen. And of course, those are all of the ancestral practices that Native people were claiming at the time as their religion, and pushing back against that. So it's a pretty ugly history, and certainly religious freedom was not applied to Native traditions until that started to change in the 1930s, but it didn't really change in most cases until the 1970s.
Yeah, I actually just looked it up because I was curious about peyote, because you were talking about different medicines, and I know that I believe it's outlawed in the United States unless it's in a ceremony related to the specific tribes or peoples that use this. But I just saw it was 1978 where it was that exception was made. So
right, and that went along with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act.
What prompted that change?
Well, I think what really prompted that change is Native activism and Native political pressure. Native people, just as the 60s and 70s were a big kind of period of social upheaval, African American civil rights movement had secured a lot of successes. The Black Power movement, there was a Red Power movement that was pushing for greater sovereignty and greater rights for Native nations and Native cultures. And so it's really Native activism that gained support in part because of the larger social changes that are happening in the United States at that time, gained support from non-Native people as well.
Very interesting. One thing you also mentioned in the book is this concept of settler secularism, which describes how white settlers defined and managed religion in ways that supported their own rule. Do you see this as something distinctive to the United States, or is it part of a broader pattern across colonial society?
I think that it is not unique to the United States, that and to understand what I've coined that term, settler secularism, and I fully expect that some people will not like it and some people will run with it and use it in other contexts. But to understand that term, you have to understand, first of all, one of the things I'm trying to do with this book is to bring settler colonial studies and what I call critical secularism studies into conversation with each other. And we've been talking so far in this conversation a lot more about settler colonialism. secularism, as understood by scholars, is not so much doesn't so much mean like opposition to religion or absence of religion, although the word colloquially means popularly means those things, right? But secularism is also about a kind of governing system that aims to, right, separate religious and political authority. And in order to separate religious and political authority, I mean, ultimately the state becomes the arbiter of that, and the state becomes the arbiter of what counts as religion. And I mean, I'm not, in saying this, I'm not necessarily opposing secularism as such. But I think it's important to see what shifts and the structures of power and the new kinds of sets of problems that are put in place when you have a new kind of governing system like that. And so the secular state then is always faced with the problem of like, well, what counts as religion? If religion is going to be free, I mean, in some ways you're going to protect the state from religious authority, but you're also going to try to protect religion from the power of the state and try to keep those two things apart. And the state becomes the adjudicator of that. And so secularism studies is trying to figure out like, what are the dynamics of that? How does that work? Who loses out? Who wins? You know, what's the? It's not a neutral system, right? Even though it very much aims to be. And so, my argument is really that in the United States, because the United States is constituted as sort of formed as a settler colonial empire, that the system of secularism here kind of configures religion in various ways to fit settler colonial goals. That's not the only thing that religion does, again, and that's kind of what I started out by, one of the things I started out by saying, but it's one of the things that that religion does. So secularism is a system, of course, that is not unique to the United States. There are many different countries that have a kind of secular system of government, probably the majority in the world at this point. And so, secularism studies is also there are scholars who think about kind of global secularisms, comparative secularisms, how secularism looks different in different countries and different parts of the world. And in some ways, secularism in a particular place takes on the religious culture or tends to define religion in ways that fit the dominant religion or drawn from the dominant religion. And that's sort of very understandable that would happen. And so in the United States, scholarship on secularism has emphasized how American secularism assumes that religion looks like Christianity, and often Protestant Christianity in particular. And so I'm adding to that picture by saying it also kind of configures religion in ways that advance settler colonial rule or that favor a kind of settler colonial system of government and disadvantage indigenous nations as well as indigenous religious traditions. So I think that same dynamic is very much operative in other settler colonial states like, Australia, New Zealand.
On a brighter note, I think last year, Yale started offering a certificate in Native American and Indigenous studies for the first time. And you were one of 6 professors who developed that certificate and made it a reality. What does it mean for Yale, both institutionally and intellectually, to formalize Native American and Indigenous studies in this way?
I think it's long overdue, and you're right, very good news. And I have to, give credit to some of my colleagues in Yale College who really did much more of the legwork for that, particularly Claire Bourne and Ned Blackhawk. But yeah, I mean, Yale has long had a small but vibrant community of Native students, including some Native students here at YDS. And the undergrads, there's a Native American Cultural Center that's very vibrant, lots of activities. It's a kind of hub for Native students at Yale. And the undergrads have long wanted a kind of certificate program to make it possible. Or, ideally, I think some would want a full-fledged major, which has never existed. Yale has never, for whatever reasons, put the resources into having the kind of departmental structure or, sufficient faculty to support a major and not even a certificate program until last year. So it makes it possible, I think, the students, whether Native or not, but most of the students who are in the program are, in fact, Native students. It makes it possible for them to not only have a focus in their work and in their coursework and, perhaps in a kind of a thesis project that they might develop as seniors in Native American studies, but it kind of recognizes that then on their transcript and on their academic record in a way that is very meaningful and significant to them, and makes it, just think kind of like having a structure there, having the recognition there, having the legitimacy that we matter, right, for them is really important.
Yeah, well, thank you for your contribution to that, because I think, as you said, it's representation, and it's also hopefully will lead to something like a major that where there'll be something more even than a certificate. So thank you so much for this conversation on both the history, especially congratulations on your new book. That's amazing that it's now out. And thanks so much for speaking with us about your research. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the interview. It's been fun talking with you.
Thanks for listening today. We hope you'll tune in again for the next episode of the YDS Quadcast.